My daughter humiliated me in front of hundreds, but 3 years later, she came back begging for help. You know that feeling when life hits you with a saxophone solo that's completely off-key? Yeah, that was my reality at 55. Name's Jerry Cooper, and if you've never heard of me, well, join the club of about 7 billion people who apparently moved on from real music sometime around the Clinton administration. Back in the day, and I mean the real back in the day, when MTV actually played music videos and people knew what a record store was, I was somebody in New Orleans. The French Quarter wasn't just some tourist trap for drunk college kids taking selfies with their dad's credit card. It was alive with the kind of music that made your soul shake hands with something bigger than yourself. Picture this. Smoky rooms where the air was thick enough to chew, filled with the sweet marriage of polished brass and Cuban tobacco. Preservation Hall wasn't just a venue. It was a temple. And me? I was one of the high priests, wielding my trusty con shooting star saxophone like it was Excalibur. Those were the golden years, my friends. The 80s and 90s, when jazz wasn't just background music for pretentious coffee shops. I'd step onto that tiny stage at Fritzl's European Jazz Club, feeling the weight of tradition on my shoulders and the cool metal of my sax against my lips. The audience would go quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get when people are checking their phones, but the respectful silence of folks who knew they were about to witness something real, something that couldn't be auto-tuned or filtered through some app. My fingers knew every key, every valve, every secret passage through melodies that most people never even knew existed. Improvisation wasn't just what I did. It was who I was. I could take a simple blues progression and turn it into a conversation between my soul and the universe. Duke Ellington once said that music is my religion, and brother, I was a devout believer. But here's the thing about golden years. They don't stay golden forever. Like everything else in America, the music industry got swallowed up by the machine. Suddenly, everything had to be digital, processed, packaged for mass consumption. Real instruments played by real people became as obsolete as payphones and common courtesy. I watched my world shrink like a cheap suit in the rain. The clubs started closing. The audiences got grayer and smaller. Younger musicians showed up with computers instead of instruments, talking about beats per minute instead of beats per heart. And me? I kept playing my saxophone to rooms full of empty chairs and faded dreams. The final nail in the coffin came courtesy of my own flesh and blood, my daughter Lydia. 23 years of Gen Z energy wrapped up in designer clothes I couldn't afford to buy her had become what the kids call an influencer. Not the good kind that inspires people to be better, but the kind that gets millions of followers by dancing in 15-second videos and pretending to discover music that was already old when I was young. She built this whole online persona around being this edgy, independent artist who didn't need anybody's help, especially not from her washed-up jazz musician dad. 3 million TikTok followers hung on her every auto-tuned word, treating her like she was the second coming of Aretha Franklin. The irony? She probably couldn't tell you who Aretha Franklin was without Googling it first. The night everything fell apart was supposed to be her big break. Some local venue had booked her for what she called her debut concert. Real instruments, real stage, real audience. I thought maybe, just maybe, this was my chance to connect with my daughter through the one thing that had always made sense to me: music. I showed up early, wearing my best suit, the same one I'd worn in my last real gig 3 years earlier. Found a seat in the back, trying to blend in with all the 20-somethings holding their phones like they were religious artifacts. The venue was packed. I'll give her credit for that. Kids everywhere, all of them looking like they'd raided the clearance rack at Hot Topic. When Lydia took the stage, she looked confident, beautiful, even. For a moment, I felt that surge of parental pride that every dad knows, regardless of how complicated things have gotten. She adjusted the microphone, surveyed the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years performing for a camera, and opened her mouth to speak. What came out wasn't just words. It was a surgical strike against everything I'd ever believed in, everything I'd ever worked for, everything I'd ever been. She dedicated her first song to everyone who'd never believed in her, which seemed reasonable enough. But then she kept going. She talked about people who thought old records were art instead of just dust gathering mold. She mentioned fathers who still dreamed about their vintage saxophones. Specifically, she said, their old Selmer Mark 6 horns, like they meant something more than just outdated noisemakers taking up space in cramped apartments. The crowd laughed, not with her, but at the target of her joke. At me. I felt something break inside my chest that had nothing to do with my heart and everything to do with my spirit. This wasn't just a daughter rejecting her father's values. This was a public execution of everything I had spent my life building, in front of hundreds of people. She reduced my entire existence to a punchline about a stubborn old man who couldn't let go of the past. I couldn't look at her, couldn't look at the audience. I just sat there, feeling shame settle in my stomach like a cold, lead weight. The worst part wasn't that she was wrong about me being washed up. The worst part was that she was right, and she'd said out loud for everyone to hear. But wait, it gets better. Or worse, depending on how you define entertainment value. See, while I was dealing with being publicly humiliated by my own daughter, my ex-wife Sandra was busy documenting her fabulous new life on Facebook for all our mutual friends to see. 20 years since our divorce, and she was still finding creative ways to twist a knife. Sandra had landed herself a 32-year-old IT genius named Brandon, who looked like he'd stepped out of a tech startup commercial. All perfectly sculpted stubble and vintage band t-shirts that cost more than my monthly rent. Meanwhile, I was still arguing with my microwave about whether leftover pizza counted as a balanced meal. Her Facebook feed was a constant stream of exotic vacations, expensive restaurants, and passive-aggressive commentary about her former life with a certain unemployed musician who shall remain nameless, but whose initials were definitely JC. The posts were masterfully crafted character assassinations disguised as lifestyle updates. She'd share a photo of her and Brandon at some upscale wine tasting, then casually mention how refreshing it was to be with someone who understood the difference between career and a hobby. Or she'd post pictures from their weekend in the Hamptons, followed by some philosophical observation about how real men provide security instead of pipe dreams. Her friends, our former mutual friends, would pile on in the comment section like vultures at a roadside buffet. Martha from the book club would write things like, "Oh, Jerry, still playing those little concerts in coffee shops? Time to grow up, sweetie." Rebecca from Sandra's yoga class would add, "Some people never learn that bills don't pay themselves with pretty melodies." Each comment was a tiny paper cut to my already bleeding dignity. These were people who used to invite me to their dinner parties, who used to ask me to play background music for their anniversary celebrations. Now they treated me like I was some kind of cautionary tale about what happens when you refuse to face reality. The internet had turned my personal failures into public entertainment, and everyone I'd ever known had front row seats to the show. So there I was, sitting in my studio apartment. And when I say studio, I mean the kind where the bed doubles as a couch and the kitchen is basically a hot plate with delusions of grandeur, trying to make sense of how everything had gone so spectacularly wrong. The walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbor's television through the drywall, broadcasting some reality show about people getting rich by flipping houses or selling makeup or whatever the American dream had been reduced to these days. I pulled out my old Selmer Mark 6, the same saxophone Lydia had mocked in front of hundreds of people just hours earlier. This instrument had been my companion for over 30 years. We'd shared stages from New Orleans to Nashville, from dive bars to concert halls. It had been there for my wedding, my divorce, my daughter's birth, and every moment of joy or sorrow in between. I raised it to my lips, hoping for familiar comfort of music, the one thing that had never let me down. But what came out wasn't music. It was a wheeze, a squeak, a sound like a dying animal. Even my saxophone was giving up on me. That's when I started laughing. Not the good kind of laughter that bubbles up from happiness, but the unhinged kind that comes when you realize you become the punchline to a joke that isn't even funny. Here I was, a 55-year-old has been, sitting alone in an apartment that smelled like microwave dinners and broken dreams, getting mocked by my own musical instrument. I was officially rock bottom. And in America, rock bottom always comes with a side of irony. Just when I thought the universe had finished using me as its personal punching bag, my phone rang. Unknown number, which usually meant either a telemarketer trying to sell me car insurance or my landlord calling about late rent. But this time, it was something else entirely. My cousin Rick's voice came through the speaker, Awkward and uncomfortable in that way that only happens when someone has to deliver news they don't really want to share. Uncle Charlie had passed away. Massive heart attack, probably brought on by his legendary diet of fried everything and emotional baggage. The funeral had already happened. Apparently, the Coopers had long ago decided I didn't count. Not for birthdays, not for deaths. Just jazz and silence. But here's where it gets interesting. Uncle Charlie, the black sheep of the Cooper family who disappeared to Memphis sometime in the late 90s, had left me something in his will. Not money. God knows none of us Coopers ever had enough of that to pass around. He'd left me his workshop. Rick's description made it sound about as appealing as a root canal performed by a chainsaw. Some kind of rundown repair shop in a sketchy part of Memphis, filled with what Rick generously called vintage musical equipment, and what everyone else would probably call junk. The family had already written it off as a worthless pile of scrap metal and broken dreams. They were practically throwing the keys at me, Rick explained, because nobody else wanted to deal with the hassle of cleaning out Uncle Charlie's mess. The city was already sending notices about code violations and unpaid utilities. It was, in Rick's words, a generous gesture of letting me handle all the headaches they didn't want to deal with. Most rational people would have politely declined. Most rational people would have suggested they just pay someone to haul everything to the dump and be done with it. But I wasn't feeling particularly rational at that moment. I was feeling desperate, and desperate people make desperate decisions. There was something about the idea of Uncle Charlie's workshop that called to me. Maybe it was a memory of the man himself, the family rebel who'd chosen music over stability, adventure over security. Or maybe it was just a pathetic hope that somewhere in that pile of Tennessee trash, I might find something worth salvaging, something that might give my life meaning again. Uncle Charlie had always been different from the rest of the Cooper clan. While my father worked in insurance and my other uncles climbed corporate ladders, Charlie played blues guitar in honky-tonk bars and fixed instruments for musicians who couldn't afford proper repair shops. He understood that sometimes the most valuable things look like junk to people who don't know how to listen. I remember visiting him once when I was maybe 12 years old, back when he still lived in Louisiana. His garage was filled with guitar cases and amplifiers, mandolins missing strings, and drums with cracked heads. To my parents, it looked like a chaotic mess. To me, it looked like a treasure cave where broken music wanted to find its voice again. Charlie had this saying that stuck with me all these years. Music never really dies, Jerry. It just waits for someone who knows how to listen. Sitting there in my pathetic excuse for an apartment, stare at my phone after Rick hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the kind of hope that expects everything to work out perfectly, but the kind that whispers maybe there's still one more song left to play. The rational part of my brain was screaming that this was a mistake, that I was a 55-year-old failure running away from his problems instead of facing them, that Memphis was just going to be New Orleans all over again, except with different scenery and the same broken dreams. But the part of my brain that still remembered what it felt like to create something beautiful, to take broken pieces and make them whole again, that part was already packing. Because sometimes, when you've lost everything that matters, the only direction left is forward. And sometimes, the universe has a twisted sense of humor about what it considers a gift. 3 days later, when Rick finally showed up with the keys and a stack of legal papers that needed signing, I knew my decision was already made. After scribbling my name on documents that officially made me the owner of Uncle Charlie's mess, I watched Rick drive away with obvious relief on his face. Then I packed. I didn't pack hope. I packed pain, brass, and silence, and pointed my beat-up Honda Civic toward Memphis, chasing ghosts and whatever Uncle Charlie thought was worth leaving behind. I didn't tell Sandra where I was going. Not that she would have cared. I didn't call Lydia to explain. Not that she would have listened. I just drove, with nothing but the open road ahead of me and the faint, desperate hope that Uncle Charlie's workshop might hold something more valuable than the broken dreams everyone expected me to find there. After all, as my grandfather used to say, sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what you're really made of. Little did I know, I was about to find out exactly what that meant. You know that moment when GPS cheerfully announces you've arrived at your destination, but you're staring at something that looks like it belongs on an episode of Hoarders? Welcome to Memphis, baby. The city that gave birth to blues, rock and roll, and apparently my midlife crisis. The drive from New Orleans to Memphis should have been a spiritual journey. After all, I was traveling the same roads that legends like B.B. King and Elvis had once traveled. This was the cradle of American music, the place where Sun Records had captured lightning in a bottle and changed the world forever. I kept telling myself that maybe some of that magic would rub off on me. But as my Honda wheezed into what Google Maps insisted was the right address, any romantic notions I had about following in the footsteps of musical giants evaporated faster than spit on a Memphis sidewalk in August. Uncle Charlie's workshop looked like a crime scene, not the kind where someone gets hurt, but the kind where good taste goes to die. The building itself was this sad, gray structure that might have been white sometime during the Carter administration. Half the windows were boarded up with plywood that had warped so badly it looked like the building was permanently winking at you. The yard, and I use that term very loosely, was an archaeological dig of musical failure. Rusted trumpet cases sat stacked next to what used to be a piano, but now looked like abstract art made of splinters and broken promises. Violin bows were scattered around like pickup sticks, and there were enough tangled cables to rig a small aircraft carrier. A hand-painted sign hung crooked by the front door. The words retro melodies were barely visible under layers of grime, and what looked suspiciously like bird contributions. Uncle Charlie had clearly been optimistic about his business prospects. I sat in my car for a good 10 minutes, just staring at this monument to musical ambition gone wrong. This was my inheritance. This was supposed to be my fresh start. This looked like the place where hope comes to file for bankruptcy. But hey, I'd driven 6 hours to get here, and my gas tank was as empty as my bank account. Time to see what Uncle Charlie thought was worth leaving me. The key Rick had given me looked like it predated the Civil War, but it somehow managed to coax the front door open with a screech that probably violated several noise ordinances. The stench hit me first, that unique combination of dust, mildew, and something that might have been mouse apartments occupied since democracy was young. The inside was worse than the outside, which I hadn't thought was mathematically possible. Everywhere I looked, there were instruments in various stages of decomposition, flutes with more rust than metal, violins missing so many strings they looked like they'd been mugged, cracked records stacked in towers that defied both physics and common sense. And the aroma. Dear God, the aroma. It was a nasal punch that could knock out a raccoon. I'd experienced some questionable air quality in dive bars over the years, but the smell like time had stopped, then rotted. I picked my way through the maze of musical wreckage, trying to find somewhere to set down my single duffel bag while contaminating it with whatever biological experiments were growing in the corners. The floorboards creaked under my feet, like they were commenting on my life choices. That's when I noticed the phonographs, dozens of them, scattered around like tombstones in a graveyard for outdated technology. Some were missing their horns, others had cracked turntables, and a few looked like they'd been used as target practice. These weren't just old, they were ancient. The kind of ancient that made you wonder if Edison himself had personally blessed them before they began their slow journey toward obsolescence. The workshop area in the back was even more depressing. Uncle Charlie had apparently been in the middle of about 50 different repair projects when he'd given up and moved on to that great jam session in the sky. Half-assembled saxophones sat on workbenches like mechanical patients waiting for surgery that would never come. I found a corner that looked marginally less contaminated than the rest and set down my bag. The reality of my situation was starting to sink in like water through a broken roof. I was a 55-year-old man who just inherited a warehouse full of junk in a city where I knew absolutely nobody. My daughter thought I was a joke. My ex-wife was living her best life with someone half my age. And now I was standing in what appeared to be a time capsule for every tune that never made it past rehearsal. But I was too tired to drive back, too broke to find a hotel, and too stubborn to admit that maybe Rick had been right when he called this place a generous gesture of letting me handle all the headaches. So I did what any rational 55-year-old would do in that situation. I cleared off a space on the floor, used my jacket as a pillow, and tried to convince myself that this was just temporary, that tomorrow things would look better. that maybe Uncle Charlie had hidden something valuable in all this chaos. The floor offered all the warmth of a tax audit and none of the resolution. Every time I shifted position, something metallic would clatter or something wooden would creak. The building settled around me like it was sighing at the weight of its own neglect. I must have finally drifted off around 3 in the morning, because I was awakened by what sounded like a tiny marching band practicing scales in my ear. Turns out it wasn't a marching band. It was mice. Lots of them. And they discovered the sheet music I'd brought with me. Original charts I collected over 30 years of playing, some of them signed by musicians who are now jazz legends. I couldn't leave them behind in New Orleans. They were my history, the only proof I'd once been somebody in the music world. I didn't trust storage units, and that music had followed me through every move. It was all I had left of who I used to be. The little rodents had apparently decided my life's work would make excellent nesting material. I watched in horror as one particularly enterprising mouse dragged away a piece of a Charlie Parker transcription I'd spent weeks perfecting. It felt like watching someone shred my soul note by note. And I couldn't stop them. Great. Now I had my own mouse jazz ensemble. At this rate, they'd probably get more gigs than I would. I salvaged what I could of my music collection, but the damage was done. The universe, it seemed, was determined to strip away every last connection I had to my musical past. Morning didn't improve the situation. If anything, daylight made everything look worse. What had seemed like mysterious shadows of night, before it turned out to be actual holes in the walls. The plumbing situation became immediately apparent when I tried to find a bathroom and discovered that Uncle Charlie's definition of modern convenience was apparently aspirational. There had never been working water here, not since I'd arrived, anyway. I trudged to the nearest convenience store, which was the kind of place where expired hopes went to buy lottery tickets. The cashier, a teenager with more piercings than a medieval torture device, looked at me like I was speaking ancient Greek when I asked about the nearest hardware store. I loaded up on survival supplies, bread that felt like compressed sadness, and coffee that could probably power a small generator. Welcome to the highlight reel of my downward spiral. On my way back to the workshop, I learned about my first neighbor. Henry appeared to be somewhere between 70 and the heat death of the universe, with a face that suggested he'd been personally insulted by every sunrise for the past 2 decades. He was standing in his yard, which, I had to admit, was meticulously maintained, staring at Uncle Charlie's property like it had just proposed to his daughter. He didn't introduce himself. He just stood there, arms crossed, radiating the kind of disapproval that only comes from decades of practice. His stare followed me from the street to the front door, and I could practically hear him mentally composing complaints to the city council. Sure enough, 20 minutes after I'd gotten back inside, there was a knock on the door. Not a friendly neighbor knock. This was the kind of knock that means business. Henry had apparently decided that official introductions were in order. He stood on my doorstep like a one-man welcoming committee for people who weren't welcome. His first words weren't hello or welcome to the neighborhood. They were, "This junkyard is bringing down property values for the whole street." He went on to explain, in excruciating detail, how Uncle Charlie had been a menace to decent, law-abiding citizens who just wanted to live in peace without having to look at what he called an unauthorized scrapyard masquerading as a business. But then Henry paused, and something shifted in his expression. He used to play every Friday night. He said quietly, almost himself. You could hear it down the block. Didn't hate it, I guess. For a second, I caught a glimpse of the man behind the scowl, someone who might have once had a heart tuned to a Friday night melody. But Henry caught himself being sentimental and quickly switched back to practical concerns. He informed me that his son Billy Bob, and yes, that was apparently his actual name, was what he delicately referred to as a handful. Billy Bob had a tendency to celebrate the end of each day with whatever alcohol he could get his hands on, and Henry was concerned that all this metal junk might give his son ideas about hosting parties in the abandoned workshop. The way Henry said it, you could tell this wasn't theoretical concern. This was the voice of a man who'd spent years cleaning up after Billy Bob's creative interpretations of weekend entertainment. Henry finished his speech by suggesting that the best thing for everyone involved would be for me to call a scrap dealer, clear out the whole mess, and maybe turn the property into something useful, like a parking lot or a small crater. I thanked him for his input, assured him I'd take his concerns under consideration, and closed the door before he could launch into what I suspected would be Volume 2 of his property value dissertation. Alone again with my inheritance, I started to wonder if Uncle Charlie had left me this place as some kind of cosmic joke. Maybe this was his way of testing whether I had what it took to turn junk into music, or if I'd just throw in a towel and join the ranks of sensible people who measure success in 401k balances and lawn care. The next few days were a blur of cheap food, cheaper coffee, and expensive life lessons. I tried to make the best of things. Really, I did. I attempted to organize the chaos, to see if there was any method to Uncle Charlie's madness. But every time I thought I'd found something valuable, it turned out to be broken in some crucial way. That's when I broke my tooth. I was trying to eat a piece of bread when I heard the crack. Not the chip of a crust, but the kind of internal pop that tells you something important just gave out. My molar had officially filed for retirement, leaving me with a dental emergency I couldn't afford to fix. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a man who'd spent his life creating beautiful sounds, and I couldn't even chew quietly anymore. Every bite was accompanied by a little whistle of pain that turned my mouth into an unintentional wind instrument. I couldn't afford a dentist. Hell, I could barely afford the bread that had caused the problem in the first place. So I did what financially desperate Americans have been doing since the founding of the Republic. I learned to live with it and hoped it wouldn't get worse. The water situation, meanwhile, had gone from non-existent to impossible. Turns out Uncle Charlie hadn't just left me a workshop full of junk. He'd also left me a utility bill that nobody had paid in months. The city had shut off water service before Charlie passed, and apparently had no intention of turning it back on without serious money changing hands. So there I was, a grown man washing his face with bottled water he couldn't afford, brushing his broken tooth with toothpaste that cost more per ounce than his daily food budget, living in a building that smelled like the inside of a gym sock that had been forgotten in a high school locker. The letters from the city started arriving on day 3. Official-looking envelopes with words like violation and compliance and deadlines scattered throughout like aggressive confetti. Apparently, my inheritance came with a side order of legal problems that Uncle Charlie had been ignoring for years. Rick hadn't mentioned any of this, probably because he didn't want to deal with it himself. "You're the musician," he'd said when he handed over the keys. Might as well inherit the music mess too. Every envelope was another reminder that Uncle Charlie hadn't just died. He'd left me holding the bill for his unfinished symphony. I was sitting on the floor of the workshop, surrounded by rusty instruments and regulatory threats, when something made me pause. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was a memory of Uncle Charlie himself, the way he used to hum while he worked on broken instruments in his garage all those years ago. Maybe it was just a desperate hope that somewhere in all this chaos was proof that music could survive anything. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before. Tucked behind a pile of broken mandolins was an old saxophone case. Not just any saxophone case. This one had Uncle Charlie's initials carved into the leather handle. The case itself looked like it had been through a war. The leather was cracked. The latches were green with age, and one corner was held together with duct tape that had probably been applied during the Reagan years. But something about it called to me. Something that whispered this wasn't just another piece of junk. I pulled the case free from its nest of musical debris and set it on one of the less contaminated workbenches. The latches protested, but they eventually gave way with a kind of creak that suggested they hadn't been opened in years. Inside was Uncle Charlie's saxophone, a tenor sax that had seen better decades. The brass was tarnished to the point where it looked more brown than gold. There were dents that told stories I'd probably never hear, and the pads were so old they looked like they'd been made from pressed dinosaur skin. But it was complete. Every key, every spring, every piece was there, and despite its appearance, something about it seemed significant, like it was waiting for something, or someone. I picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It was heavier than my Selmer, built like a tank from an era when instruments were made to last through jazz club fights and cross-country tours in the backs of unreliable vans. The serial number was so worn I couldn't make it out, but the craftsmanship was unmistakable. This was a working musician's instrument, an instrument that had stories to tell. If only I could coax them out. There was something jammed deep in the bell of the horn. I thought it was just accumulated dust and debris. Later, I'd find out it wasn't. For the first time since I'd arrived in Memphis, I felt something other than despair. It wasn't hope exactly. It was more like curiosity. What secrets was this old horn hiding? What music had it made? And why had Uncle Charlie kept it when he'd apparently given up on everything else? I sat there in that musty workshop, holding my uncle's saxophone while my skirt around my feet, and Henry probably plotted my eviction from across the street. And I thought about something Charlie used to say. Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most broken instruments. Maybe he'd been talking about more than just saxophones. Maybe this place wasn't a graveyard after all. Maybe it was a tuning fork, waiting for someone broken enough to hear the note it had been holding for years. Outside, Memphis continued its business of being a city where legends were born and dreams came to die. Inside, I was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, Uncle Charlie had left me more than just a pile of junk and a stack of unpaid bills. Maybe he left me a chance to prove that even the most damaged instruments can still sing, if someone's willing to hear them. I just had to learn how to listen to what they were trying to tell me. The first weeks in Memphis were like being slowly roasted over flames of my own poor life choices. And I mean that literally, because someone actually tried to burn down my inheritance. But let me back up a little. Those early days weren't just about mice and broken teeth. They were about becoming the neighborhood freak show. Every morning, I'd drag myself outside to sort through Uncle Charlie's collection, and every morning, I'd notice the locals walking by with that particular Memphis mixture of amusement and disgust. The kids call me the crazy old white guy who played with junk. Fair enough, from their perspective. I probably looked like someone who'd lost a fight with a garage sale and decided to move in with the wreckage. Teenagers would slow down on their bikes, pointing and laughing at the man who spent his days elbow deep in rusty trumpets and broken drums. But the adults were worse. They'd whisper to each other as they passed, loud enough for me to hear. There goes that old fool, digging through Charlie's trash like he's going to find buried treasure. Some of them would shake their heads with that southern blend of pity and judgment that cuts deeper than any insult. I tried to ignore them. Really, I did. I'd put my head down, focus on the work, and pretend I couldn't hear their commentary on my life choices. But when you're already at rock bottom, every judgment feels like someone dropping another boulder on your chest. Then came the night that almost ended everything. I'd spent the day trying to make sense of a pile of sheet music that looked like it had been through a paper shredder and a washing machine. My back was killing me from hunching over workbenches that were clearly designed for someone with a very different relationship with gravity. When evening rolled around, I decided to walk to the corner store for what had become my standard dinner, a sandwich that cost $3 and tasted like cardboard with delusions of grandeur. The walk back should have been peaceful. Memphis in the evening can be beautiful, especially when you catch the light just right hitting those old buildings. The air carries hints of barbecue and music history, and for a moment, you can almost believe you're walking the same streets where legends once changed the world. But as I turned the corner onto my street, I saw smoke. Not just any smoke. Thick, black, angry smoke pouring from the direction of Uncle Charlie's workshop. My workshop, my disaster of an inheritance, was literally going up in flames. I ran faster than a 55-year-old man with questionable knees had any right to run. The front entrance was ablaze, orange flames licking up the door frame like hungry tongues trying to taste everything Uncle Charlie had built. That's when I saw the note, tucked under a brick that had been thrown through one of the few unbroken windows. The paper was singed around the edges, but the message was clear. Stop disgracing Memphis with your junkyard. This city deserves better than your trash. I stood there holding that note while the Memphis Fire Department showed up to put out what remained of my front door. Neighbors gathered to watch the show, some looking concerned. Others looking like this was exactly what they'd expected from a crazy old man and his pile of musical garbage. The fire marshal said it was clearly arson. Someone had soaked rags in gasoline and shoved them through the mail slot. Professional job, he said with the casual tone of someone who'd seen this kind of thing before. Probably kids, he added, looking around at the assembled crowd like he he was taking mental notes. But I had a pretty good idea who might have done it. Henry's son Billy Bob had been hanging around more often lately. Sometimes drunk, always looking at my place like it personally offended him. Henry himself had made it clear that my presence was unwelcome, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Billy Bob might have decided to take matters into his own hands. When I confronted Henry about it the next day, he just shrugged and said Billy Bob had been confused about which property was which. Boys will be boys, he said with a kind of dismissive tone that suggested this wasn't the first time his son had accidentally committed arson. I wanted to punch something, or someone, but standing there in the ashes of my front entrance, surrounded by the smell of burned dreams and charred wood, I realized something important. I wasn't ready to give up. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was desperation. Or maybe it was a memory that hit me like a freight train as I stared at those blackened remains. I remembered sitting barefoot on Uncle Charlie's garage floor when I was maybe 12 years old. We had plastic cups full of Coke in our hands, and Louis Armstrong was playing on an old radio that crackled with static. Charlie had just finished repairing a violin that someone had given up for dead, and the sound it made when he tested it was pure magic. If you can ever breathe life into dead sound, he told me that day, then you're a real musician. Everything else is just noise. That memory hit me harder than the smoke inhalation. Charlie hadn't been talking about instruments. He'd been talking about life itself, about finding beauty in broken things, about refusing to let other people's garbage become your reality. So I did something that probably confirmed everyone's opinion about my mental state. I laughed, standing there in the ruins of my inheritance. Covered in soot and clutching a threatening note, I laughed until tears ran down my face. Then I got to work. The next morning, I started clearing out the fire damage with a determination that surprised even me. Every broken piece of wood, every melted remnant of Uncle Charlie's collection got sorted into piles, salvageable, reparable, and genuinely dead. The salvageable pile was bigger than I'd expected. Turns out Uncle Charlie had built this place to last. Most of the instruments had survived the fire, protected by their cases or hidden deep enough in the workshop to avoid the worst of the damage. And that's when I really started paying attention to what I was dealing with. These weren't just random pieces of junk. Charlie had collected instruments from different eras, different styles, different stories. There were jazz pieces from the 40s, country instruments from the 50s, rock equipment from the 60s. Each instrument was like a page from American music history. A trumpet with dents that probably came from late-night jam sessions in smoky clubs. A guitar would wear patterns that told stories of countless performances. Drums that had kept time for dancers who were now grandparents. I found myself handling each piece like a surgeon, trying to understand not just what was broken, but what it had been before it broke, how it had lived, what songs it had helped create. That's when I discovered something interesting about Uncle Charlie's old saxophone, the one I'd found hidden behind the mandolins. The fire had actually helped clean some of the grime off the case, and I could see details I'd missed before. The brass wasn't just tarnished. It was worn in specific patterns that suggested this horn had seen serious action. The mouthpiece showed tooth marks from someone who'd played it regularly for years. The key where patterns indicated a musician who favored certain scales, certain fingering combinations. But the real discovery came when I decided to clean out the bell properly. I'd noticed something stuck deep inside, but I'd been putting off dealing with it because the saxophone itself seemed too damaged to save. That changed after the fire. Something about nearly losing everything made me want to understand what I actually had. So I worked carefully, using tools I'd found in Charlie's workbench to extract whatever was jammed in there. It wasn't just dust and debris like I'd assumed. It was something wrapped in old cloth, wedged so deep it had probably been there for decades. When I finally worked it free and unwrapped it, I almost threw it away. It was smaller than a regular record, maybe 6 inches across, scratched, dirty, with a label so faded I couldn't make out the text. The kind of thing you'd find in any vintage shop's dollar bin. But something about it nagged at me. Maybe it was the weight of it, or the way the scratches caught the light. This small disc didn't feel like some random piece that had gotten wedged in a saxophone bell by accident. I couldn't make sense of it on my own, and frankly, I was tired of trying to solve Uncle Charlie's mysteries without help. So I decided to reach out to the one person I knew who might understand what I was looking at. Nate Williams had been my closest friend during the good years in New Orleans. We'd played together in more dive bars than either of us could remember, and he had the kind of encyclopedic knowledge about music history that made him dangerous at trivia nights. Last I'd heard, Nate had given up performing and opened a little antique shop in the French Quarter, the kind of place where tourists bought overpriced vintage postcards and locals came to sell family heirlooms they couldn't afford to keep. It took me 3 phone calls to track him down, and when I finally got him on the line, his voice carried 20 years of water under the bridge. "Jerry Cooper," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "I heard you disappeared into the wilderness. You calling from a mountain cabin or a federal prison?" "Neither," I told him. "I'm calling from Memphis, and I think I found something you need to see." Driving back to New Orleans felt like traveling through time. Every mile between Memphis and the French Quarter was loaded with memories of who I used to be, who I thought I'd become, and who I'd turned out to be instead. Nate's shop was exactly what I'd expected. Cramped, cluttered, and full of things that had outlived their original owners. Old jazz posters covered the walls, vintage instruments hung from the ceiling, and the air smelled like dust and old stories. When he saw me walking with the record, Nate's expression shifted from friendly nostalgia to professional curiosity. He'd always been able to spot something special from across a room, and I could see his antique dealer instincts kicking in. "Let me see what you've got," he said, pulling out a magnifying glass and a set of white cotton gloves like he was handling evidence from a crime scene. What I didn't know about Nate, what he'd never mentioned during all those late-night conversations about music, was that he'd spent 2 years in the early 70s working as a sound engineer at Sun Records. He'd been there during some of the later sessions, helping preserve and catalog recordings from the studio's legendary early days. When he examined my record under proper lighting, his hands started shaking. "Jerry," he whispered, and his voice had the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious experiences. "Do you know what this is?" I told him it was a record I'd found stuck in Uncle Charlie's saxophone, probably worthless, maybe something Charlie had been using as packing material. Nate looked at me like I just told him I'd been using the Mona Lisa as a coffee coaster. "This isn't just any record," he said. "This is a lacquer pressing of Elvis Presley's first recording session at Sun Records, July 5th, 1954. My happiness, and that's when your heartaches begin. There were only a handful of these made, and most of them were destroyed or lost years ago." He paused, studying the label more carefully. "This is one of the ones Elvis gave to the studio technicians as thank-you gifts. Sam Phillips had a few made specially for the people who helped make that session possible." The room went very quiet. Outside, I could hear the familiar sounds of the French Quarter, tourists laughing, jazz music drifting from nearby clubs, the eternal carnival that keeps New Orleans alive. But inside Nate's little shop, time had stopped. "You're telling me this thing is actually worth something?" I asked, because my brain was having trouble processing what he was saying. "Jerry," Nate said, and his voice was barely a whisper, "if this is authentic, and everything about it suggests it is, you're holding the holy grail of American music memorabilia. Collectors have been looking for one of these for decades." He went on to explain that this wasn't just any Elvis recording. This was the session that changed everything. The moment when a 19-year-old truck driver walked into Sun Records to make a recording for his mother and accidentally launched the rock and roll revolution. The lacquer pressings were made as gifts to the people who witnessed history being made. Most had been lost or destroyed over the years. The few that survived were worth millions, not thousands, millions, to the right collector. I sat there in Nate's cluttered shop, holding what might have been the most valuable piece of music history in private hands. And I thought about Uncle Charlie. How had he gotten it? Why had he hidden it in his saxophone? And why had he never told anyone what he had? Maybe he'd known exactly what it was worth and decided that some things were too important to sell. Maybe he'd been saving it for the right moment, the right person, the right emergency. Or maybe he'd known that whoever found it would need it more than he ever did. Nate offered to help me authenticate it properly, to connect me with auction houses and collectors who dealt in this kind of treasure. The process would take time, he said, But if the record was genuine, my days of eating cardboard sandwiches and sleeping on workshop floors were over. But first, there was something I needed to do. I needed to go back to Memphis and figure out what Uncle Charlie had really left me. Because if he'd hidden something this valuable in an old saxophone, what other secrets might be waiting in that pile of musical wreckage? For the first time since my daughter had humiliated me on stage, I felt something that might have been hope. Not the desperate kind that comes from having no other options, but the real kind. The kind that whispers maybe broken things really can sing again if you know how to listen. Money isn't music. That thought kept hammering in my head like a broken metronome as I sat in Nate's shop, holding what might have been my ticket out of poverty. The authentication process took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of experts examining that little disc under microscopes, comparing to database records, running tests I didn't understand on equipment that probably cost more than my car. But when the final report came back, it was official. I was holding one of the rarest pieces of American music history ever discovered. The auction house estimated it would sell for somewhere between $2 and $4 million. $2 to $4 million. I'd gone from counting quarters for gas money to potentially join the ranks of people who have financial advisors and tax problems. But here's the thing about sudden wealth when you spent your whole life being broke. It doesn't feel real at first. It feels like a mistake, like someone's going to knock on your door and ask for their lottery ticket back. I found myself pacing around that Memphis workshop at 3 a.m, staring at instruments I'd been dismissing as junk, wondering what Uncle Charlie had really been trying to tell me. Was the record just luck? Or had he known exactly what he was leaving me? The more I thought about it, the more conflicted I became. Selling felt like betrayal, not just of Uncle Charlie, but of something deeper. Every time I'd compromised my music for money in the past, I'd lost a piece of myself. The wedding gigs where I played elevator jazz for people who weren't listening. The corporate events where my saxophone became background noise for small talk about quarterly profits. I remembered the worst one, a pharmaceutical company's annual meeting where they wanted me to play upbeat melodies while they discussed raising insulin prices. I took the money because I needed to eat, but I felt sick for weeks afterward. Money isn't music, I kept telling myself. But maybe that was the wrong question. Maybe the real question was, could money serve music instead of corrupting it? That's when Nate called with an idea that changed everything. "Jerry," he said over the phone, "I've been thinking about what you told me, about wanting to honor Charlie's memory, about feeling guilty for selling something so historically significant. What if this record isn't meant to disappear into some private collector's vault? What if it's meant to give other people the same chance Charlie gave you?" He painted a picture I hadn't considered. Instead of seeing the money as an ending, what if it was a beginning? What if Uncle Charlie had hidden that record knowing that someday someone would need it to rebuild not just their own life, but to create something bigger? If she gives you the chance to open music to others, Nate said, then maybe this is her final song, meant to be played in a whole new way. That conversation shifted something fundamental in my thinking. Uncle Charlie hadn't been a hoarder collecting junk. He'd been a curator, preserving instruments that had stories to tell, waiting for someone who could help them tell those stories again. The auction was held in New York, in one of those fancy houses where people bid on art like they're buying groceries. I didn't attend, couldn't afford the trip, and honestly, couldn't bear to watch strangers fight over Uncle Charlie's secret. But when the final hammer fell, that little disc sold for $3.2 million. After taxes, auction fees, and Nate's finder's commission, I was left with just over $2 million. More money than I'd ever dreamed of having. The first thing I did was fix my tooth. Then I bought a decent meal. Then I sat in my hotel room and stared at a bank statement that looked like a phone number, trying to figure out what Uncle Charlie would have wanted me to do next. The answer came to me while I was driving back to Memphis, listening to a blues station that was playing Old Sun Records tracks. The DJ mentioned how many legendary musicians had gotten their start in that one little studio, how Sam Phillips had created something that changed the world by giving unknown artists a chance to be heard. That's when I knew what Retro Melodies was supposed to become. Not just a repair shop, not just a place where broken instruments went to die, but a place where music could be reborn, where people who've been written off could find their voices again. I threw myself into rebuilding that workshop with the same intensity I'd once brought to learning jazz scales. Every day was 16 hours of work. Cleaning, organizing, renovating, learning skills I'd never needed before. I hired contractors to fix the fire damage and upgrade the electrical system. I installed proper lighting, climate control, and sound dampening. I bought tools I'd only dreamed of owning. Precision instruments for adjusting valve alignment, specialized oils for restoring vintage brass, equipment for repairing everything from 19th century harmonicas to modern synthesizers. The sign Uncle Charlie had hung crookedly by the door, Retro Melodies, got a professional restoration, but I kept it in the same spot at the same angle. Some things shouldn't be fixed too much. Within 6 months, word started spreading through the Memphis music community. There was this guy who could bring dead instruments back to life. Not just repair them, but restore their souls. Musicians started showing up with family heirlooms, vintage pieces they'd inherited but never been able to play. My first real success story was a Vietnam vet named John who'd lost his left arm in combat. He brought me a harmonica his grandfather had played during the Depression, said he'd always wanted to learn but never figure out how to manage it one-handed. It took me 3 weeks to design a custom harness that would hold the instrument steady while letting him use his right hand for advanced techniques. When John played his first clean melody on that restored harmonica, we both teared up. The sound was pure, sweet, and absolutely heartbreaking. Word of mouth in the music world travels faster than gossip in a small town. Soon I was getting calls from Nashville, New Orleans, even Los Angeles. Professional musicians sending vintage instruments they couldn't trust to anyone else. But the work that meant the most to me was local. I started offering free music lessons every Saturday morning, focusing on kids from neighborhoods where music programs had been cut from schools. These weren't privileged kids with expensive instruments and private tutors. These were children who'd never touched a real piano, never held a trumpet, never heard jazz played live. I saw myself in every one of them. That kid who'd sat in Uncle Charlie's garage, wide-eyed and wondering if he'd ever be good enough to make real music. Amber was 8 years old when her grandmother brought her in, born blind, but with an ear that could identify individual notes in a complex chord structure better than most professional musicians. The first time she sat at the restored 1952 Baldwin piano I'd bought for the shop, her tiny fingers found melodies that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her years. Within a year, she was composing pieces that made grown musicians weep. The local paper did a story about her, calling her a prodigy. But I knew better. She wasn't just talented. She was proof that music lives in places most people never think to look. There was Marcus, a teenager from South Memphis who'd been getting into trouble until his mother dragged him to one of my Saturday sessions. He had anger issues, attitude problems, and hands that could coax magic from a beat-up drum kit I'd restored from the 60s. Drumming gave him a way to channel all that rage into rhythm. 6 months later, he was keeping time for a local blues band, earning money and staying out of jail. The grandfather and grandson who brought me that mangled trombone became one of my favorite restoration challenges. The instrument had been in their family for 3 generations, but nobody had played it in decades. It was dented, corroded, and missing several key components. I spent 2 months hunting down original parts, cleaning decades of tarnish, and rebuilding the slide mechanism from scratch. When I handed it back to 12-year-old David, fully restored and gleaming like new brass, his grandfather started crying. 3 months later, David won the regional middle school jazz competition, playing that same trombone. His grandfather called me that night, voice thick with emotion, to say it was the proudest moment of his life. That's when I realized what Uncle Charlie had really left me. Not just money, and not just instruments. He'd left me the chance to be part of other people's music stories, to help broken things sing again. Retro Melodies became more than a business. It became a community center, a music school, and a place where instruments went to be reborn. Musicians would hang around after picking up repairs, jamming with whoever happened to be there. Saturday mornings turned into impromptu concerts when my students would play for anyone who wanted to listen. The workshop that had once smelled like mouse droppings and failure now rang with the sounds of restored trumpets, rebuilt guitars, and voices discovering what they were capable of. I kept Uncle Charlie's old tenor saxophone on a stand near my workbench. Never played it. Somehow that felt wrong, like wearing someone else's wedding ring. But I liked having it there, a reminder that some music is too important to sell even when you desperately need the money. Money isn't music, I'd learned. But in the right hands, money can be an instrument too. It can create harmony where there was discord, give voice to the voiceless, and help broken things find their song again. Standing in my transformed workshop, surrounded by the sound of restored instruments and developing talent, I finally understood what Uncle Charlie had been trying to teach me all those years ago. Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most broken places, but only if someone's willing to do the work to bring it back to life. 3 years later, I was sitting at my workbench fine-tuning a 1947 Martin guitar when she walked in. I'd heard whispers through the Memphis music grapevine about her career hitting some rough patches. Her latest album had tanked, and word was she'd been asking around about analog recording techniques. But I never expected those whispers to materialize in my doorway. Just like that. No warning, no phone call, no dramatic entrance music. Just my daughter Lydia, standing there like she'd never called me a washed-up old fool in front of hundreds of people. She looked different, tired. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by jeans and a faded band t-shirt. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she was clutching an old microphone, the same one she'd used during her brief moment as Memphis's next big thing. The music industry, it turns out, has a way of humbling people who think they've figured it all out. Lydia's career had followed the typical trajectory of social media stars who try to transition to real music. Initial buzz, major label interest, one album that nobody bought, and then the long, slow slide back to reality. Her latest album, the one that was supposed to prove she was a serious artist, had flopped spectacularly, not because the songs were bad, but because they sounded like everything else flooding the market, overproduced, auto-tuned, and missing that indefinable quality that makes music stick in people's hearts instead of just their heads. She stood there for a long moment, watching me work on the Martin's Bridge. I didn't look up immediately, not out of spite, but because I was genuinely focused on what I was doing. When you're adjusting string height to within thousandths of an inch, everything else becomes background noise. When I finally set down my tools and acknowledged her presence, I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before, genuine uncertainty. This wasn't a confident influencer who dismissed my life's work as dusty nostalgia. This was a young woman who discovered that talent without wisdom is just noise with good marketing. "Dad," she said, and her voice carried none of the casual dismissal I remembered. "I've been listening to recordings from that Elvis record you found, the one that made all the news, and I realized how little I actually knew about music." She paused, looking around the workshop at the restored instruments hanging on the walls, the awards from grateful musicians, the photos of students who'd gone on to scholarships and professional careers. "I need your help," she continued. "I want to re-record my album, but I want it to sound like this place feels. Real, honest, like the instruments you've been bringing back to life." I could have been petty, could have reminded her that night when she'd publicly humiliated me, when she'd reduced my life's passion to a punchline about moldy old records. But standing there in my workshop, surrounded by restored treasures that had been written off and made whole again, I realized something important. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing to let healing happen. "You know, Lydia," I said, setting down the guitar and really looking at my daughter for the first time in years, "sometimes the most valuable melodies are hidden in the oldest instruments. The trick is learning how to listen for them." I gave her a tour of retro melodies, not as a father trying to impress his daughter, but as someone sharing something they genuinely loved. I showed her Amber's piano, where the blind 8-year-old had learned to channel pure emotion through ivory keys. I demonstrated the custom harmonica setup I'd built for John, the Vietnam vet who'd refused to let the loss of an arm silence his music. This isn't just about fixing broken instruments, I explained as we walked through the workshop. It's about understanding that everything worth saving has a story, and sometimes that story includes being broken for a while. Lydia listened without interrupting, without checking her phone, without the casual arrogance that had defined our previous interactions. When I finished the tour, she asked if I'd be willing to help her record her album using analog equipment, with real instruments, in a way that honored the music instead of just exploiting it. I agreed, but on my terms. No shortcuts, no digital crutches, no auto-tune safety nets. If she wanted to make real music, she'd have to learn to make it the way it had been made for generations, with skill, patience, and respect for craft. We shook hands on it, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had a daughter again instead of just a stranger who happened to share my DNA. Later that afternoon, as I was closing up the workshop, I heard a tentative knock on the door. When I opened it, I found Henry standing on my doorstep. Not the aggressive, property value obsessed Henry, who'd threatened to call the city on me 3 years ago. This was a different man, humbler, older, and carrying something that looked suspiciously like gratitude. "Mr. Cooper," he said, and his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "Turns out that boy of mine's got rhythm. They gave him a spot in that youth jazz thing. Didn't think all that blowing on brass would amount to much. Shows what I know." Henry paused, looking past me into the workshop, where David's restored trombone gleamed under the lights. He told me how the boy practiced every day after school, how music had given him confidence and direction, how other kids in the neighborhood had started coming around, asking if they could learn instruments too. "I was wrong about all this old stuff," Henry admitted, gesturing vaguely at my collection of restored instruments. "Figure it was just noise and clutter. But watching that boy play, hearing the joy he brings to it, well, I reckon some things are worth more than I gave them credit for." It was the closest thing to an apology I was going to get from Henry, and honestly, it was enough. Sometimes the best relationships aren't built on grand gestures or dramatic reconciliations. Sometimes they're built on the simple recognition that people can change, and that being wrong about something doesn't make you a bad person. It just makes you human. A week later, David showed up at my workshop with a piece of wood and some tools. He'd carved a sign. He said something he wanted to hang in the shop if I'd let him. The inscription was a quote I'd shared with him months earlier, something Uncle Charlie used to say that had become my personal motto. Music never really dies. It just waits to be heard again. David had burned the letters into a piece of oak, sanded it smooth, and finished it with the kind of care that spoke to hours of patient work. When he asked where I thought it should go, I pointed to the wall next to Uncle Charlie's restored saxophone, right where everyone who entered the workshop would see it. As he hammered the sign into place, I realized this moment represented something bigger than just a grateful grandson honoring his music teacher. This was a new generation choosing to value what previous generations had built, choosing to see beauty in things that others might dismiss as obsolete. David stepped back to admire his work, and I saw Uncle Charlie in that gesture, the same careful attention to detail, the same quiet pride in craftsmanship, the same understanding that some things are worth preserving simply because they're beautiful. That evening, as I locked up retro melodies and headed home to my comfortable apartment, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From humiliation of my daughter's public dismissal to the discovery of Uncle Charlie's hidden treasure. From sleeping on the floor of a junk-filled workshop to running a business that had restored hundreds of instruments and changed dozens of lives. I'd found something more valuable than money in that old saxophone. I'd found my purpose. The kid who'd sat in Uncle Charlie's garage listening to Louis Armstrong had finally grown up to become the man Charlie always knew he could be. Not just a musician, but someone who helped other people find their voice. Someone who understood that broken strings could be retuned, cracked can be mended, and tarnished brass can shine again with the right kind of care. Standing outside my workshop, listening to the distant sounds of Memphis at night, the same city that had given birth to blues and rock and roll, the same streets where legends had walked, I finally felt like I belonged somewhere. Uncle Charlie had left me more than a workshop full of broken instruments. He'd left me a chance to discover that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't what someone gives you. It's what they teach you to build for yourself. And sometimes, if you're really lucky, you get to pass that lesson on to the next generation. Music might fall silent for a time, but the right hands always find a way to bring it back to life. That night, I went to sleep knowing I had become exactly who I was meant to be. Not because I could play a perfect solo or hit every note flawlessly, but because I learned to help others find their voice. In the end, that's what music is really about: connection, healing, and the stubborn belief that beauty can emerge from the most unlikely places. Uncle Charlie knew that. And if you're lucky, someone will come along who knows how to tune you just right. The workshop was quiet now, but it wasn't the empty silence of abandonment. It was the peaceful quiet of a place where good work gets done, where broken things find their way back to wholeness, and where every day brings a possibility of helping someone discover the song they never knew they had inside them. Some stories end with a bang. Mine ended with a whisper, the kind of whisper that carries further than any shout, the kind that echoes in the hearts of everyone who believes that second chances are worth taking, and that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from learning how to listen.